Thank you for having me here today to share some of our recent research around gender equity in women in sport in the Americas Paralympics. I'm honored to be here today amongst I'm a room full of wonderful leaders, women leaders in sports, emerging athletes, and key decision makers to share this information and to hopefully spark conversation for the rest of the day. So when I started working with the APC group, we were wondering about what was the state of gender equity in sport, in Paralympic sport, in across the Americas. And so when we want to do this in a research perspective, we always start from a baseline. So we needed to know where we were before we started making any changes. And then when we would make some changes, how do we track those to make sure we're seeing progress? And so this started with data collection. We looked at doing some surveys of APC national Paralympic committees, both in 2023 and 2025. And then we collected data around gender related to NPC leaderships, board chairs, board presidents, board members, general secretaries, CEOs, and staff. And of course, we also wanted to know what was going on at the athlete level, both at the Parapan Games and Paralympic Games teams from different nations inside the Americas Paralympics. So we used a scoreboard that comes out of the United States. If we just said anything below 50% was a failure, we would be in F at all times. And so in order to track progress, the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport in the United States had come up with a gradient scale that allowed us to give a gender equity scorecard. So anything that sits below sort of 24, 25% gives a failing grade of F. But you can see as we go up from there all the way towards an A plus at 50%. And this would allow us to track changes in the data and show progress. It's always important, I think, to be able to show progress because it doesn't happen in big steps. Sometimes it's small steps, but as those small steps gain momentum, we start to see change over time. So we use this gender scorecard scale to assess the data that we collected from the APC. So first we started with board presidents and board compositions. And as you can see from 2023 to 2025, we didn't see a change in board presidents under 25%. So we're still in the F category for this. Not expecting to see a change as we know there are term limits for presidents. So it would take some time for individuals to change in those positions. And overall, if we put our board composition together from 2023, we saw that it was a bit better. We had 25%. So we were over that F and moving into the D category. So we are seeing some women on boards in the NPCs across the Americas. When we looked at the CEO and general secretary level, we're seeing that improve. We had a C plus here for 35% of these leaders were women. When we looked at all of this together, boards, leaders, women, percentages across the entire sort of leadership categories, we saw a D plus. So we are moving up in this category as well and seeing some change. Our next area we looked at was athlete participation. So first we started with the Parapan Games and looking at them from Toronto 2015 through to Lima through to Santiago. And you can see that we saw an increase from the Toronto Games, moving from a C plus to a C, from a C minus to a C plus. And we've stayed at that for Santiago so that the games are still, for the Parapan level, still have some ways to go to get towards that A or A plus for an equal gender, 50% women, 50% men on the teams. Different story when we look at the Paralympic Games, particularly the summer games. If we track them from Rio to Tokyo to Paris, we see that we're constantly increasing. And we look at this situation saying we've gone from a B to an A at the Paris Games, meaning that most teams that came from the Americas Paralympics region were gender equal. And the important thing to remember with this set of data is that at the same time, while women weren't always at 50%, they were winning close to 50% of the medals. And so now we finally see that the gender equality on the team has come to also where the medal winning is. So when women were less members of the team, when they were in the 30%, they were still winning close to 50% of the medals. And we've seen that continued as their participation in the team has increased. Different story when we look at the Winter Paralympic Games, and this is probably a factor of who we all are in the Americas as countries. And so, Pyeongchang, we went from Pyeongchang to Beijing, and we're actually decreasing in gender equity. And so I think there's some work to do and some thoughts around how do we increase and continue to work towards more gender equal teams in the winter sports. So overall, top data points from this were that we saw that 1/3 of the teams in the Tokyo Paralympics were gender equal. We kept that sort of number going for the Paris Paralympics games, which led us to a better score overall for the Americas Paralympics, and that we saw the Parapan games are still, I guess, in a growing stage towards gender equity, and we didn't see as many teams were gender equitable across the board for different nations within the APC for those games. I kept this slide to show you that we were tracking in Rio both the chef de mission, the coaches, and the medical staff. And so I think it's important to understand that representation isn't just athletes and leadership. It's also all aspects of teams, in particular for coaches. We need coaches who come to this sport, and we'd like to see them in both genders. And I think the role models are needed there. We did see chef de missions, a gender equal, and a good representation in medical staff. So this data we haven't kept collecting, and I would like us to keep doing that so we can see how it changes from games to games and hopefully track some positive growth there as well. We also asked in a survey, we asked some of the NPC leaders to tell us what's going on from your perspective in terms of either using, different strategies that may be around for gender equity. And so at this point, we saw that, in 2023, 50% of NPCs had guidelines around using gender equity focused languages, images, and communications, and look at the increase. We've seen that now in our most recent survey at 73%. So when we get into some of the questions around the barriers around awareness, we see that we're already making some changes in how we present athletes and our NPCs. NPCs with published gender equity goals, we saw a decrease in this. And, my interpretation of this is that we are seeing other avenues being used to improve gender equity, and so that some of the goals may not be as published anymore because they're inherently embedded in most strategic plans or programs at this point. And we're looking at do NPCs embed gender equity in their staff and volunteer recruitment? And I think we're sort of seeing that we're sitting in the 45 to 50% rate. So most NPCs are thinking about this and looking to do it in terms of embedding it in how they recruit both staff and volunteers to their organizations. With all the data we've collected, it's also, we thought, important in this survey to sort of get what's the lived experience or what's the knowledge from the individuals who are at the front lines of sport in the Americas Paralympic movement. And so we asked sort of 3 questions in 2025. What were the top barriers to entry-level parasport participation from their experience? What were the top barriers to high-performance parasport participation for women? And then overall, from their perspective and their experience, what were the 5 top barriers for women in sport leadership roles? And you can see here that we see some commonalities between each of these 3 areas of participation. So certainly for entry level, number 1 is lack of awareness, understanding that parasport exists and the opportunities are there, financial barriers, and cultural barriers. And you see that we see cultural barriers through each of the 3. And this is about both attitudes towards women in society, but also around gender diversity and inclusion in general. When we look at high performance parasport, we start to see that some of the aspects around regular life come in. So worker education responsibility seems to be one of the top barriers to continuing to participate, but also is the lack of targeted high performance programming for girls and women. So if we remember from the beginning, we see that we have gender equal teams, but we're also seeing women win more medals. And so this might be a place that we want to invest. And again, we're looking at in terms of women's roles in leadership across the Americas Paralympics region. Attitudes towards gender, disability, inclusion in sport is number 1 barrier. Cultural, social barriers is number 2, and communication and awareness of opportunities. On the bottom of the slide, you'll see the previous barriers from 2023. So cultural was still there. Lack of support seems to have sort of dropped off in the top 5. Funding seems there, communication, and interestingly, which we'll come back and talk to, education seems to, in this one, not be in the top 5 reasons or barriers that individuals who filled out our survey saw. So let's go through the results a little bit more in detail. So in 2023, 64% of respondents, which increased to 66%, felt that cultural and social barriers were the biggest barrier. So we're still seeing this as the top barrier for both gender equity for women in sports leadership. So gender bias, traditional views, favoring males in sport leadership roles, etc. So we haven't made progress in this one yet, and women are still seeing this as the top barrier. The next one was 44% felt attitudes towards gender disability inclusion. So sort of expanding that. So not just looking at gender equity, but that disability inclusion attitudes, but at a lower level still played a role in 2025. And we saw that in 2023 that a large percentage of our respondents, 64%, thought the lack of support, the prioritizing of funding as a barrier for women in sport. And this didn't come through in the same way in the 2025 data. We did see an interesting change in educational barriers. So in 2023, we saw that 50% of respondents thought that educational barriers were really a problem, meaning access to education and mentorship, lack of programs to assist women's transition from athlete to coaching, or just to build women's leadership. And that seemed to decrease significantly. And so I would take this to say that some of the programs that have been discussed and implemented across the different NPCs are starting to see some changes. That we do have some mentorship programs going on. We do see that there are programs that are targeting moving women into coaching. So I think that we're seeing that the educational barriers, when we see targeted actions, have decreased. From the 2023 data, we still saw that occupational barriers were almost at 50% with our respondents. And so these are things like the gender wage gap, work-life balance difficulties, and childcare access. And among those occupational barriers, the top three were childcare, work-life balance, gender wage gap. This is not unique to sport. This is something we see in literature for women across all industries. And in fact, we know that research has recently shown that while women in some relationships, if they are the top wage earner, they still, for the most part, 75% of them are still bearing most of the work at home as well. So women carry this dual role at all times, and it does provide some barriers that we can think about in terms of actions to help support and overcome. When we looked at communication and awareness, it stayed near the top. So it's still in the top 5 for all respondents in our 2025 data. And so this is things like lack of women role models, gender attitudes towards gender and conclusion, and why it would be important, and general biases towards women in sport leadership. In general, we always sometimes break this down into a very simple saying of, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And in this situation, we're still looking where we need to build awareness and visibility of women as role models and women in leadership roles, both in athletes, but also inside organizations, as a way to sort of start building that sort of communication and awareness around the opportunities for women, and that women do exist in these roles across the Americas. So before we get into, what can we do? What are the actions? I know that's very much the focus for the meetings today and all of you coming together. I think what works for gender equity in sport is something we've studied in literature for a long time. So what you see on this slide is essentially almost like a 20-year look at all the research studies that have said what has worked across all kinds of sports, all kinds of countries inside sport to move forward with gender equity at both leadership levels and participation levels. And so we see a list here. We see programming efforts, so directed programming for women and girls, both leadership programming, but also participation programs, training programs that are specifically aimed at building leadership inside organizations and across organizations for women. Quotas have been successful. Some organizations have used these for quotas on boards. I know inside of my home country of Canada, we do have those types of situations around boards on our national sport organizations. Networking opportunities are very important. So whether it's events like you're having today where you come together, whether it's informal networking, whether it's networking electronically, how we do so much these days, these opportunities are important. Certainly compensation structures for equal pay. The wage gap is definitely noted across sport, and we also notice this outside sport, but it's something that can help alleviate some of this. And then overall representation in the media, and we saw that we see some changes around that, around how organizations and NPCs in the Americas are dealing with how they portray women athletes, but we also need to see women leaders in the media. Outside of sport, the Harvard University has something called the Gender Action Portal Database, which looks at studies from around the world. I think almost 325 studies, 47 different countries, all kinds of industries. What has worked for gender equity from their database? So you're going to see some things that are very similar to what works in sport, but it's always important for us inside sport to also look outside and what can we learn from others. And so something that's different in there certainly is marketing the business case for gender equity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Implementation of gender equity training. So we see training programs across both. Leveraging allies for gender equity. And that's individuals who are sitting in the room today. And what can we all do as allies? And particularly, we're going to talk a little bit about what men can do as allies for gender equity. Certainly human resource programming. So whether this is embedded in your recruitment strategies or not, this makes a difference. And mentorship. So we see mentorship being there again for women and girls in sport could work from what we've learned from outside sport. So again, this is from a large study done from the group in Canada that used to be the National Network for Gender Equity in Canadian Sport. We put this report out in 2021, but here's the biggest actions. We're going to talk about actions today. We want to be action oriented in our discussions. So what does it mean for all of us in the room today? So certainly marketing the business case for gender equity. This is about training. This is about focusing on real world examples that show why gender equity is something we want in our sport organizations. This involves training for women leaders in sport. Particularly, we know there's a lot of data out there from consulting companies that basically shows that corporations whose boards and leadership are gender equal actually perform financially better. And so that's always, to me, the business case to make is the return on investment. Gender equal boards, gender equal leadership in organization leads to better financial returns. That's one great example. Mentorship programs for women sport leaders using top-down selection processes. Think about inter-organizational mentorship programs. If you are the only woman at your organization, or there are a few of you, what other organizations do you come into contact with? What other sports? What can you do in a room like you are in today to start to build a mentorship network? Something we said we wanted to talk about, leveraging allies for gender equity. So talking to all the men who are sitting in the room with us today, we can't do this without you. 50% women means 50% men are still in the room. And we need men to realize the importance of gender equity, both for society, both for our economy, but for our sport organizations, and then also understand the role you have to play. Certainly when women aren't in the room or at the meetings, this is a chance for men to be allies, to advocate for women participation programs, to advocate for women in leadership roles. So I think there's lots to think about and hopefully discuss today how men can play a role and be allies for gender equity in sport today and beyond today. And then I think, as I've mentioned before, there's certainly a lot around human resources and programming that can be done. Gender equity programs, it seems those are starting to build in the NPCs that we've been surveying. Targeted recruitment and promotion for women. Sometimes as far as blind candidate interviews where you don't actually know the gender before you invite people for interviews. Gender neutral language and job postings, it has really shown to make a difference. And we can look at tracking these, so I'm a researcher. I'm very keen on tracking diversity and equity goals. That's why we use these scorecards. That's why we're doing these surveys. So you have to know where you're starting from, and you have to be able to track your progress so that you really know that what you're doing is making a difference. And then I think really key, we have to understand work-life balance and programming for women, given the still heavy social load that women play in the family structures. In terms of sport participation, we certainly need role models. So all young athletes that are sitting in our audience today, you young women, are incredibly important to building this role models, to be visible, to be aware, so that other young girls who want to be in parasport can see you, can see your success. We know you're winning medals. We know you're winning events. And these are the types of things that other young girls need to see at this time. Certainly social encouragement and social environments around sport are important for girls. And also early exposure. And sometimes I think this is more difficult perhaps for parasport than non-parasport, but early ages and how we can think we can get to them when they're younger. Certainly we've seen a change in NPCs about changing and promoting equity in sport messaging. That's changed, and we should continue to do that. Certainly working with media that we bring into organizations about how we can better use gender neutral language or promote women athletes. And then often there's opportunities for women-only sport and thinking about how you build that into your parasport networks. And again, we go back to the programming. Programming is always important for girls to participate in sports. So things that look at self-esteem and belonging, certainly important for all girls in all types of sports. And then again, a mentorship program for women and girls. And I would say, again, athletes in your clubs and your organizations can start to build this for the younger athletes, and we can build that laddering effect from entry-level para athletes all the way through to our high-performance para athletes who are representing us at Paralympics and Parapan Games. So I want to leave you with just these thoughts at the end of today. We really want to be action oriented now. We've done a lot of look at where we are and what are the barriers, but how do we all work together to make these changes? So everyone in the room today is needed. I really wish I was with you in the room today and not just virtually, because I'm sensing there's an energy there today that will help build these actions. So everybody has to think about, how can you take action? How can you take action, today, tomorrow, in the organization you're in, and the networks that you belong to, and the countries that you come from, and the teams that you interact with. And I'll go back to saying to all the men in the room and to the women, we need to be allies, which means when we are women in a room where we're the only women, we need to bring up other women's names. We need to look at opportunities for those women. We need to build those actions and work behind the scenes for them. And of course, we also need to think about being a role model. All of us can do these roles, right? We can all be a role model. We can all play a role, even if we don't think we are. We are. Just by holding the positions that we hold and being inside sport as women, we are role models. We need to build a network. I've witnessed the power of a network of women across the APC coming together to do this kind of work. I think you can build a network. You can build a network in your neighborhood. You can build a network in your local sport clubs. You can build it locally. You can build it regionally. You can build an international network. But really, it is about bringing women together to share experiences, to support each other, to have that person you can call when you're facing a problem that you haven't faced before and you want some advice. Athletes can do this for each other, how to build those kinds of networks to help support each other as they train. And as you progress through your careers, it's important to think about being a mentor. So you can be a role model, but being a mentor is really about being there every day and thinking about how you can support other women who are trying to climb the ladder to where you are. And I would hazard to say we should stop calling it a ladder, and we should think, when you get to these top positions, throw down a net and let everyone climb up to be with you. And my last 2 points, always, I would be remiss as a researcher if I didn't say we need to collect data and evaluate actions, and making sure that we're changing things with all the work that's going to come out of your discussions today. And lastly, as always, I think it's important to celebrate our successes. Today is a success, bringing this group together. I think if we can focus on those successes, we're feeding right back into awareness. We're feeding right back into building those networks, showing those role models, and being an ally. And so as I leave you today, I hope that your work today, some of this will inform it, that you'll have fruitful conversations, and I look forward to seeing what comes next from all of your discussions today. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.